I, Randhir Kumar, on behalf of Vishwaneedam Center and the Swadhyay Sachakra, we welcome you to attend today's Swadhyay Sachakra dialogue. The topic of today's talk is composing the common, the institution of Gaia and the end of science as we knew it. Isabelle Stengers' critique of predatory cognition and human exceptionalism. It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available with us distinguished speaker, participants, friends, viewers both on Facebook platform and Zoom platform. I welcome Paul Schwartzentruber, a creative thinker, a beautiful soul from Canada. I welcome Moderator Professor Ananta Giri, Minti Pradhanji, Gyan Guloi, our co-nurturer, and many friends co-present here. Let me give a brief introduction to our respected speaker, Paul Schwartzentruber. He is a deep seeker, independent thinker, creative writer with a deep interest of intercultural and interreligious dialogue. He has worked as the director of a retreat center in Ontario from 1997 to 2007, and he has been a lecturer in Graduate School of Theology at John's University in Gwalior, Minnesota. He had a deep interest of theology, and also he has engaged with Gandhian insight, Gandhian theories, and he worked with many important Gandhian organizations. Ekta Parishad is one of them. And he is also engaged in peace studies. He has been part of International Gandhian Institute of Nonviolence and Peace in Madurai. During this time, he traveled extensively in India, doing advocacy work, documenting many creative social movements, website development, and volunteering also the activist orientation of the knowledge system. He has published many scholarly articles. Recently, I have read one of his articles on decolonizing and Anthropocene culture. We have just seen one book called Hindu and Gandhi. There I wrote his very deep article and insightful article. So on behalf of Vishwaneedam Center, we are very grateful that he accepted our invitation to nurture this important dialogue. Our Swadhyay Sachakra is a circle of co-learning and mutual studies. It is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to walk and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chittaranjan Das, a creative soul from Orissa, and many others from around the world. We invite people like Paul to share their lives, vision, sadhana for creating this world of a cosmos, world of for all, for beauty, dignity, and dialogue. So we meet every Sunday or sometimes on Wednesday And this is a very important topic and very insightful topic also, to think a science beyond the imagination of science, to think science for humanity, and to think science for this just world in the context of sustainability or better future. So with this brief introduction, may I like to invite our speaker to kindly share his thought and help us to understand some detailed aspect of the topic. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very loud and clear.
Okay, good. I'm really happy to be here and happy to be invited by Professor Ananta Giri to give this presentation. He's been a guide for me for many years since I came to India. I always feel like I learned so much from India, from being in India. And Ananta was one of the people who accompanied me in that learning process and continues to accompany me. So I'm very grateful to him for continuing to help and foster my exploration. So I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about and hopefully locate it in a way that is accessible to you. I'm guessing at my audience, so I'm not sure if you're feeling lost or confused, I'd be happy to see someone raise their hand and ask a question. So I've spent a lot of time trying to understand Gandhi and writing about Gandhi, and then as I came back to North America, trying to connect him to some of the other people that I have been reading and studying. And one of the people that I did that with was Deepesh Chakrabarty, who's written a wonderful book called The Climate of History. And he's in dialogue with another interesting old fellow who has recently just passed away, Bruno Latour. And Latour spent his life, he was a French sociologist of science, spent his life working and being in dialogue with the woman I want to talk about, Isabelle Stengers. She's a French-Belgian thinker who started off being trained as a chemist and then went on to do work in the philosophy of science. And so I want to explain a little bit about her and how I came to read her. So I'll start by doing that, giving a bit of an overview. She started off as a chemist, but I think she quickly became concerned with the problem of the scientific view of the world and whether what she was discovering in her practice as a chemist could be fitted into the scientific method. And she went on to make a distinction between the practice of a scientist, the practices that a scientist does, the concrete work that they do, and the way they think of their method. And so that distinction between practices and methods is something that you'll see throughout her work. And I think it's a very important one. I'll try to explain it more as I go along. She was very critical from the beginning of the model of science that we all inherited from modernism, from the Europe of modernity in the 17th and 18th centuries. That model of the scientific view, which had a sense of the subject who could stand back and look at the world, and the world, which was a passive kind of object that was just there for us to look at and explore and examine. Because what quickly happened, of course, was the development of industrialism and capitalism and the global economy. And we took that scientific model and applied it to our use of the world and thought, well, it's all here for us to use. It's our resource. And we continue to think in that way. Everywhere you look around you, you see human beings taking from the earth without thinking, what is the impact of this taking? What is the impact of us all driving cars and burning fossil fuels? And what consequences does that have? So for Stengers, behind that was the question of this model of the subject and object that European science elevated, mostly Kant, into a model for how to understand ourselves and our relation to the world. When Ananta invited me to write something about the idea of transposing the subject object, well, let's call it the subject object binarity, the way in which we look at the world as subjects and objects, human beings and everything else. I was very attracted to look at Stengers' work because I didn't know much about it. And so what I'm going to present to you today is very much just a first critical reading through of her work and trying to locate its arguments and its understanding. I don't come from a science background. Indeed, I come from quite a humanities background. And so a lot of these concepts that she's talking about are novel to me. But I also think it's very important for people who are scientists to, and as they're doing all over the world now, to step forward and try to articulate how their work is intertwined with what's happening to us in the world all around. And that's very much what she wants to do. So I think in her work, there's a growing concern for what we call the climate crisis and climate change, and it quickly unfolds into a critique of capitalism, which she identifies as barbaric. And that's a very interesting switch because as you know, the rise of industrialization in Europe and the scientific model was used to say we're civilized and the rest of the world who don't have those ways of looking at it are barbaric. So Stengers is kind of reversing that judgment and calling what we're doing in the West to the world as barbaric. And so her question is, how can we act now, given where we are in the process of climate change? How can we act in a way that is not barbaric? How can we change the course of our thinking and acting? And how can we develop a response to what she describes as the intrusion of Gaia? I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. It's a very unique understanding of the climate crisis, this notion of the intrusion of Gaia. So I think it's important to hear her conception. Some of the texts that I'll be referring to are available in English translations. This is one of her most recent ones. Another Science is Possible. I guess is it showing up backwards on your screen? Sorry about that. It has a nice snail there. And another one is In Catastrophic Times, Resisting the Coming Barbarism. So those are two of the works I'm going to refer to quite a bit, but she has several others. She developed a series on the topic of cosmopolitics, politics of the cosmos. And I'll come to explain that a little bit. She also spent her career collaborating with some really interesting people. I mentioned already Bruno Latour. In her early life, she collaborated with a physicist who won the Nobel Prize for his work in physics. She collaborated and studied a lot with the French philosophers Deleuze and Guattari. She collaborated also with a psychoanalyst named Chertok. And there's another person she collaborated with that's going to come to me any minute. Oh, why she wrote about the English American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who was kind of the father of pragmatic philosophy. Anyway, I'll come back to all of that. That was just a kind of overview. I want to start in the middle of things by reading you a section from her most recent work where she talks about the situation that we're in right now. So this is a section from the book In Catastrophic Times. Those who, like me, take note that it is a matter of learning from now on what a response to the intrusion of Gaia that is not barbaric requires, and insist on the necessity of new practices of struggle are considered naive. But Naming Gaia, she who intrudes, signifies that there is no afterwards. It is a matter of learning to respond now, and notably of creating cooperative practices and relays with those whom Gaia's intrusion has already made think, imagine, and act. Naming Gaia is accepting to think with this fact. There is no choice. In other words, there's no other place to begin. So what she means by the intrusion of Gaia is kind of what we've all come to realize slowly in the last 20 years, that what we as human beings have done has affected the planet to such an extent that now we're feeling the forces of the planet coming back upon us and on our way of living. And we see this around us everywhere when we look today. She wants to describe that as the intrusion of Gaia. And I think it's important to think about that a little bit. Intrusion means that it's an interruption. And what it interrupts for Stengers is the idea that human beings think of themselves as untouched, as above the world, as observers of the world. So that's very much the rational scientific model of the human being. And again, that the world is apart from us and there at our feet, waiting for us to use in whatever way we want. So that self-understanding now, it doesn't work anymore. And everywhere around us, we see the evidence that it makes no sense to think of ourselves that way. And so we're caught in this place of, oh, this is how I've been thinking of myself. This is how my father and my grandfather and my previous generations have thought of themselves, but it doesn't work anymore. How should I do it? And that's very much where she wants to start with. Gaia intrudes and poses a question to us that we're forced to respond to. Now we can bury our heads in the sand. That's what she means by becoming barbaric. We can pretend that none of that is affecting us, or we can figure out how to respond. And what she wants to develop is an understanding of the human being's potential to respond, our response ability, which is a word that's often used in feminist texts recently by Donna Haraway, for example. What are we capable of responding? How are we capable of responding? And very much this idea is very much developed as a critique of what I've called human exceptionalism, the sense that we think we stand above everything else, and also of predatory capitalism, which is really based on predatory cognition. So we see the world the way we want to see it from our particular point of view, and then we use it the way we want to use it, again, from our particular point of view. And her critique of both of those things is very important. I want to try to develop that. One idea that she proposes as a way of rethinking how the subject and object, how the human being and the world are related to each other, is from grammar, the middle voice. I don't know if in Sanskrit there's a middle voice. In English we have it sometimes. It's when we try to say, well, for example, some people photograph easily. So some people photograph easily, or this countertop will wipe clean without much work, also easily. We're talking not about the particular thing, but how things are interconnected. I act, but as an agent, I've already been affected by many things, and I'm continually responding to those things. And all of our action is interwoven in a kind of karmic way. So I respond to actions that I feel, I sense that come to me. And so whenever we talk, we should not talk about, I started this, I found the right way, but I was led to the point by all of these other factors of seeing this. So that's kind of what she means by the middle voice. And the proposal that she wants to make is that we learn, we experiment with the practice of talking and acting together again. Exactly what we're doing here. This seminar that you've set up is what she would call the practice of acting and thinking together. Because she says what capitalism has encouraged us to do is not to think together, but to think in one way from the basis of a theory that's been imposed upon us, the theory that we stand above everything. Again, so we have to drop that theory and just come back to a group like this and how we think and act together. And we have to experiment with how to do that. And she's especially encouraging scientists and people with a science background to shift from that scientific model to this model of experimentation. I'll just say a little bit about her development, trying to keep an eye on the time here. As I say, she worked early on with a physicist named Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in, I think, the 70s for arguing that reality was irreversible. What he meant by that was that things happen and you can't, there's an arrow of time and you can't go back to the past. You can remember it, but you have to move forward. And that the reason that that's important is because in classical physics, time was not a factor. So for Einstein or for some of the other early physicists, the issue of time did not really come up. So Prigogine insisted that time was important, that I'll just read you a section. The natural contains essential elements of randomness and irreversibility. This leads to a new view of matter, in which matter is no longer the passive substance described in a mechanistic worldview, but is associated with spontaneous activity. This change is so profound, we can now really speak about a new dialogue of the human being with nature. So this was an important insight for her to see that the world itself was moving and changing, that there was things everywhere we looked. Nature was not static, but was active, and it was active with many, it was interactive with many agents collaborating and working together to shift and change things. So nature was constantly moving. And science would have to, if it was going to see nature, it would have to follow it. In other words, so later on, she will talk about a model of science as nomadic, that it has to be based on observing, following, and working with the natural world. The classical model of science had left out or left to the side all of that changeability and the interrelationships. And so she's trying to bring those back in. Her work with a psychiatrist was very interesting. This is just a small footnote. She wrote about Freud and Freud's use of hypnosis. I don't know how much you know about that, but in his early career, Freud would hypnotize his patients and they would tell him all of their dreams and their secrets. But he quickly realized that he was having a big influence on the patient, that he was changing the way they viewed things. And he thought, oh, well, I want to be, he wanted to fit into the model of science that was then practiced where you're just a detached observer, you don't have an influence. And so he changed his model of sitting behind, having his patient lie on the couch and sitting behind them in a white lab coat to make himself feel like he was not influencing them. So she's quite critical of this shift that happened in Freud and in many of the early thinkers who used their scientific practice and tried to fit it into the model of a static, mechanistic worldview of science. In the middle of her life, she started a big work called the Cosmopolitics. I'll just tell you a little bit about that. She wrote about different incidents in the history of science, and she tried to argue that the disagreements that scientists had were not about their practices, but were about how they related to the theory of science. And so she proposed a different way of thinking about the disagreements among scientists. And I'll just tell you a little bit about that. There were three ideas that she had that she thought were important. She wanted scientists to, the first one was reclamation, reclaiming. She wanted scientists to reclaim their practices from the tradition that said the world is made up of a subject and an object and human beings stand above it all. So we were going to leave that theory behind and take our practices and try to understand them in a different way. She also pointed out how in that tradition, human beings are disempowered. Power is taken away from them. So the power that we're exercising today by coming here and thinking together, I hope we're thinking outside of the box and outside of the mold. That power is often taken away from us because we're given a theory of how to look at the world, or we're socialized into frameworks in which we look at the world in very narrow ways. So part of what she wants to do is to say where human beings have been disempowered, where they've had their power to think and act taken away from them by these theories or these big ideas, we need to reclaim that power. And the only way to do it is to get together with other human beings and to do what we're doing today. I was going to read you one other little note here. Well, actually, I'll leave that. The other thing that she wants to do is to talk about how to civilize the practices of science. What she means by that is that we've all been socialized in a certain tradition. In my case, I've been socialized in Western European thinking. Even though I live here in Canada, I'm still very much embedded in that way of thinking. And I realize that I now have come to the point where I realize that way of thinking has created immense destruction all around the world. So how can I civilize what my understanding is without falling into that barbaric way of relating to the world? And she wants to explore that idea. So interestingly enough, she's not saying we have to start over completely in the way Gandhi did. She's saying we're embedded in this tradition and we could use this tradition, but we're going to use it in a different way. We're going to learn how to civilize it. And by civilize it, she basically just means to share it together with others, to be open to the questions that other people have about what we're doing. In her mind, when she was writing this book, she was talking about the crisis with genetically modified food in the early 2000s and Monsanto, and talking about how activists were pushing against Monsanto and its claims about genetically modified food. But scientists were often indebted to the large corporations because of grants and funding. And so they were much more reticent about entering into that open public debate. Now, we don't see that so much anymore. Many scientists are entering into the open public debate, and they're doing it in a very profound way. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing she wants to talk about. Okay, I'm just going to try to wrap up what I was going to say because I'm running out of time. I think the importance of her work is that she takes this idea of moving beyond the subject-object binary into the context of science and hard science, like the practice of science, and asks scientists to say, can you liberate your practices as a scientist from that theory and that tradition which has caused so much damage in the world? How can you do that? Can you find a way of connecting with people which doesn't betray your science, but also opens it up to questions and objections and understandings of other people? So we have lots of environmental debates today in the city where I live. they're building low-income housing, but they're doing it by destroying a wetland, which is crucial to the microclimate of Nova Scotia. So there's a debate to be had there about low-income housing is important, but so is the impact of this wetland. And we can't just simply remove the wetland and expect everything to be fine. That's the kind of debate I think that she wants to have more and more of, and to provide a context for people to think about it and to talk together. She calls this ethical experimentation. How do we stay true to what we understand, but also become open to the objections and the different views of other people? What she's talking about here in the third sense is renewing the bonds of interrelationship, the bonds in which embed us in the world that we're looking at. And I just want to end with one of her last essays. That was an essay that was entitled, "The Earth Will Not Allow Herself to Be Observed." The Earth won't let herself be watched. And why won't the Earth let herself be watched? Because the Earth is folded in such a complex way, and it folds us in, the ones who would like to watch it, into a location, a tradition, a way of looking at things. And there's no space outside of it, no outside that we can assume to look at the world and get the right idea of what the world is. The only way we can do that is by looking with other people and acting with other people. Okay, I think I'll stop there and see if there are questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really a very fascinating lecture, and I really appreciate the kind of deep engagement with the very insightful imagination that you brought here in this lecture. And now I would like to invite Professor Ananta Giri. Actually, he has to give the kind of brief introduction, but he can be as a discussion of today's session. So, Ananta bhai, over to you.
So, thank you so much, Paul bhai, for your kind co-presence and your presentation. So, I greet you and all friends from Pune. So, I have been here in this MIT World Peace University for the last 2 days, part of a very interesting conversation. And thank you, Paul bhai, to bring Isabelle Stengers and her work in philosophy of science, and Ilya Prigogine. So this is much interesting, and the whole idea of rethinking the subjectivity and objectivity. So I look forward to thoughts from other friends, and towards the end, after listening to Paul bhai's response, I may be able to share a little bit, 1 or 2 more thoughts. Maybe if the queries are not coming, I can share 1 or 2 more queries. And you mentioned about, our working with Ilya Prigogine. And if you can kindly elaborate that a little bit. And her critique of existing science and bringing the temporal dimension. So thank you for kindly expanding these a little more.
Yeah, I could try to say a little bit more about that. What she took from her collaboration with Prigogine was the idea of that there was an irreducible uncertainty about the world. That is, there could never be a final summing up, a final theory that encompassed everything, because reality itself was constantly changing and transforming. You see this a lot in the most recent work of people like Ananta, who's written a lot about the art of noticing, how things reform even when they've been negatively impacted by climate change. They find other places to grow, and they find other connections with things. So what she meant by that, what she took from that, was the idea that we have to keep watching. We can never put a period in reality and say, okay, now I've got it. I understand it. Nothing new can happen, which is obvious when you think about it for a minute, right? Not only are we moving and we're part of that process of change, but we can't go back, as Prigogine said. You know, there's an irreversibility to time. That was quite a challenge to the classical scientific model, I think, because most of the, and I'm not an expert here, so I'd be happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. Most of the early theories in quantum physics were based on the idea that time didn't matter. It was all causality. So it didn't matter if it happened before or after that. That was simply the human world. And again, that model of science excluded a large realm of human thinking as superstitious or as not rational enough to qualify. So that's another part of the critique of the classical model of science. So she shifted away from the idea that you could explain what science is epistemologically. That is, by thinking, how do I observe? How does a scientist observe? Well, he puts on a white lab coat and he stands back and looks at the world. And it's usually a he, right? Because it was also very paternalistic. And tries to shift to the model of the scientist who's engaged with what they're working with. So the scientist has gone to a laboratory. He's brought what he's going to observe into the laboratory. He's observing it there. So he's carried on a lot of actions which influence what he's looking at. And then he pretends that he didn't do any of those things, that he's just looking. So that's part of the critique that comes out of this early work with Prigogine, that we have to see the constant changes in reality and the way we as human beings are woven into those changes. We're a part of them. That's not to say that we don't have a view of them, but our view is always partial and it's temporal. So it's going to be superseded. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. And you mentioned about her bringing a women's perspective and her critique of Freud. And is she also a psychoanalytic practitioner?
No, I don't think so. But she worked with this psychoanalyst, Leon Cherkov, who was also in France, I think. So it would have been in the 70s or 80s, I guess. And wrote a book with him on this history of Freud and his use of hypnosis, out of which she developed more of her understanding of the critique of science, of the classical model of science, as you know, that the observer doesn't influence what they're looking at. So I think that was also a very important early development of hers. Her contribution was to take this into the dimension of what she called cosmopolitics. And by what she meant by that was what we're doing right here, sharing in a way ideas that we know will impact each other and being open to disagreements or different understandings.
It's very nice. And in a way, she's cultivating a new philosophy of science. And if you could, with your deep knowledge about philosophy of science, and for example, you have also gifted us the thoughts of Ivan Illich. Very you have meditated with Ivan Illich, who is also
Yes.
of science and so if you could share a bit about what might be a border crossing dialogue between Ivan Illich and Isabelle Stengers.
That's a big question. I think what I'd start doing is maybe come back to her idea of Gaia and her understanding of the way that forces us to change the way we think and the way we think together. So I'll just read you a little section from this book on barbarism. Gaia is the name of an unprecedented or forgotten form of transcendence, a transcendence deprived of the noble qualities that would allow it to be invoked as an arbiter, a guarantor, or a resource. So kind of the traditional theistic understanding that there's someone outside the universe who will bless us in our work and say, oh, you saw the right thing, you understood. So Gaia isn't like that. Gaia doesn't care. Gaia is indifferent. And there is an indifference in the universe that we human beings have to come to terms with. We have to do the right thing, but we can't expect to be rewarded for doing the right thing. There's no one, according to her, there's no one there to reward us. The reward has to come from our own sense of ethics, of having done the right thing, having been faced by difficult choices, and how we responded to them. And so she says, this intrusion of this type of transcendence, which I'm calling Gaia, makes a major unknown, a mystery, which is here to stay, exist in the very heart of our lives. So it seems to me this is the deepest level of her thought, this mystery that exists at the very heart of our lives. And we have to we have to let it impact us, whether we're a scientist or not scientist, whether we're just an ordinary person. We don't have an explanation. We don't have a full understanding. We never will. Although we long for that as human beings, we long for a theory that would explain everything. But accept the mystery that you will never get beyond and think with it or think in the middle of it. I think that really is her deepest insight, and try to find ways to do that. I'd have to think more about Illich and Gandhi, but as I was writing the paper, I was thinking a lot about a dialogue with Gandhi that would happen there. His sense that somehow we had to keep knowledge at arm's length, or the theoretical knowledge at arm's length, if we were going to act ethically. We had to be careful of it. Whereas she's very much saying we have to redeem it from its misuse, and we can redeem our complex scientific thinking from being misunderstood and bring it back into the public forum again. So it's a very different model than the one Gandhi has, but it would be interesting to see them in a dialogue. Can we go back and see if anyone has questions?
Hello. May I ask, pardon my ignorance, I just would like to know a little bit about the cosmopolitics. Can we explain a little more about cosmopolitics? Thank you.
She wrote it originally in French in the at the end of the 1990s, so in 1997. And she wrote it in 7 parts. And so it was a study of 7 different moments in the history of science. So for example, when quantum physics emerged, and the conflict that arose among other scientists in integrating new things. So she looked at those historical situations in the history of science, and she wanted to ask, and her question was, if we get out of the model of there's one right answer, who's got it, if we let that drop, can we look at the controversies as dialogues? Can we come back to the point of seeing, oh, well, you say this and I say this. So there must be a way that our different viewpoints can be reconciled or brought closer together or brought into dialogue so that we see where the disagreements are. So that was very much what she was trying to do in the Cosmopolitics. If you want to read more about it, this book and other science as possible, the last chapter is a kind of summary of her idea of cosmopolitics. And she explains it very, very well there. Let me just read at the end of her book and see if this helps. The idea is not to transcend the particularity of the so-called modern tradition, which is kind of what Gandhi was aiming at, but rather to think with this particularity, to induce the capacity to imagine the possibility that it can be regenerated or civilized, which does not mean universalized. It means thinking with its own specific, dangerous, and never innocent ways of relations. It means thinking with the resources that it may be able to activate in order to enable us, perhaps, to think with other peoples. So it's kind of a vision of decolonizing science, decolonizing that understanding of science and the Western version of the colonization, and seeing if it can be understood in different cultures in complementary ways.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Yes, perhaps I do not know whether I should wait as the moderator. I thank you very much for the brilliant exposition and the ideas, which enriched me very much. I would like to perhaps to ask something about the exceptionalism. That is, I have the impression that she developed the idea against the exceptionalistic way of seeing humanity in an autonomous way, or perhaps I'm mistaken. That is, I found the concept very many times, not always, but very many times in theological context, in contemporary theology, in all the theories which say that actually man, in Christian theology, man has received a stewardship and not a dominance on nature. That is, stewardship means something and dominance means something else. The paradigmatic vision of Christian theology is, up to a certain point, as being that of the exceptionalism, that is the correlated with the dominance. That is, human beings have received an absolute power or nearly an absolute power of nature, whereas I would say in the last century, for instance, there are in Germany Jürgen Moltmann, but of course it is not the only one. Robin Hetfield in Cardiff, for instance, who have developed the theory, an alternative theory of theology, which is stewardship. Stewardship, the men have received stewardship and non-dominance of nature. I was impressed by the fact that she developed a similar theory, because I have the impression that she did not have theological assumption as the first ones, or perhaps I'm mistaken. That is, perhaps she has also, excuse me, a theological formation, and she has developed some of ideas in science about moving also from theological assumptions. I am asking this because, if I'm not mistaken, but I should control, Prigogine was one of the persons who signed the Humanist Manifesto, if I am not mistaken. And in the Humanist Manifesto, one of the principles is this, that is, human beings are a part of nature, that is, you cannot separate, which is, of course, also a position against the whole Cartesian tradition, which is human beings and, for instance, on the one hand, nature and animals on the other side. So, well, I was wondering among this point, that is she also influenced by theological assumptions, or rather she has developed these theories through and thanks to a common work with Prigogine? Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I would make one more distinction from what you said. So it was the case in the pre-modern world. So in the world of the Christian Middle Ages, for example, the belief in human exceptionalism was pivotal. Human beings were at the pinnacle of creation, right? And we'd been given a special task and job. So when modernity came along in the beginnings of science, there was a strong reaction against the theological version of that. But ironically, and this is, I think, where Stengers is coming from, people like Kant and Galileo before him developed another version of exceptionalism on which the scientific claims were based. So that was, we can rise above our passions, our superstitions, all of the things that influence us, and be rational. So we can control our, if you think of Descartes, you have that very clear sense of the mind and the body. And I think in all of those early thinkers, that hierarchy was very strong. So that version of human exceptionalism is the one that she's reacting to. And I think she's reacting in the way Prigogine develops it. But you're quite right that many theologians in modern times, postmodern times, we might say, like Moltmann, have developed their own critique of exceptionalism and tried to use the language of stewardship to bring us back to where we ought to be. I think it's too far gone. To stewardship is not enough anymore. We need to see how we're totally embedded with all the other creatures in a world which we never can get out of. And the person who has articulated this most strongly, I think, is Bruno Latour, someone I would like to study more, maybe on the rebound from Stengers. Anyway, I hope that addressed what you were saying. I would like to also maybe just leave you with the question of how this sounds differently in India and in North America. So I'm not aware of how it would sound in India. My perception when I was there was that there were many people who were quickly westernizing and modernizing, and that the idea of science, the grand idea of science, was important to a lot of people as a way of moving forward. And so this critique of that idea of science might be received differently. I don't know, just a question or a thought.
Thank you so much. So, Miniti Pradhanji, you are requested to please offer a vote of thanks. It was really a very insightful lecture. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I am Minati Pradhan on behalf of Sadhyasa Chakra and Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. Would like to thank our today's chief speaker, Paul Schwartzentruber, for his very insightful presentation. Indeed, it was a learning session for me. It was a new subject also for me to learn about Isabelle Stengers. Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us. I thank our moderator, Professor Kumar Giri, for providing us this platform to learn and explore new dimension every week. Thank you, Ananta, so much. I thank Professor Ganluigi for being present with us and being active participant with us. Thank you so much. And I thank all our Zoom platform participants and Facebook platform participants for being present with us and learning. And at the last, not the least, I thank Professor Randhir Kumar Gautam for being our convener and arranging and executing these nice webinars every week. And pardon me if I've forgotten anybody's name. I thank everyone and thank you all and good night.
Thank you.